For a season, it will seem like it's over. For a season, it will seem like it's not making any difference. For a season, it'll seem like, man, why bother? Why even take the time? For a season, it seems like a dead-end road. And listen, some of us, we've made decisions based on what it seems like, failing to realize that when it comes to a seed, the place of death and the place of destiny, they look the same for a season. They look the same for a season. This is key. You got to get this, because I found that the enemy will try to bury you in the very place God has planted you. The enemy will try to bury you in the very place that God has planted you. It's why some of us are so quick to pull the plug on the very destiny God has for you. It's why you won't stay in church, or it's why you give up on that ministry dream. It's why some of us, we go from relationship to relationship and marriage to marriage, because the same place where God planted you is the same place the enemy loves to kind of come in there. And the very place where God's trying to make you, the enemy likes to try to whisper, hey, no, God's forsaken you. And it couldn't be more than the opposite reality when it comes to the story. See, if the story will come to reveal to us anything, it's about a God who speaks to us that in the darkness, it's actually in the times where I can't see what or how this is going to work, that we have a God who says, this is actually where I do my best work. It's when you're under pressure. It's when you're underpaid. It's when you're undervalued. It's when you're under depression. It's when you're under a whole bunch of stuff. This is where God would say, this is actually where I do my best work. Because listen, if you're a seed of God, it's when you're most under pressure that what's in you most comes out of you. And if you are a child of God, if you've surrendered your life to Jesus, if there's seed of potential, a dream, a plan, a purpose He's placed inside of you, listen, it's when you're under pressure that stuff comes out. In fact, and some of you know this, some of you have experienced this. It's when you, like, you didn't even know, like, you could pray the way that you prayed until you got that doctor's report. And they told you, hey, look, it's not looking good for you. Like some of you, you understand this because you didn't know you could have that kind of faith until you had the kind of faith that all of a sudden believed in a God who can move mountains. See, it's when you're under pressure that what's in you, the potential that's in you, starts to come out of you. And this is so important. See, as followers of Jesus, you got to understand the darkness does not intimidate me. The darkness actually germinates me. It's a starting point of what God's wanting to do, what God's wanting to work. In fact, I love going back to this story. One of the commentaries kind of noted that the very place that they actually hid Joash in the temple, it was actually the place closest to where, in Jewish thought and mindset, was the place closest to God's presence. See, because he was actually hidden in the Holy of Holies, this kind of veiled off area. And it was in the Holy of Holies, there was the Ark of God. And the Ark of God, on top of it, had this kind of like, looked like two kind of gold angel wings. And this is where they saw and they understood the presence of God to sit, the presence of God to rest when it came to showing up in the sight of the very people of God. And I love that because, again, of all the places he could have been, all the places they could have hid him, they chose to hide him in the place closest to his presence. Right there with God. And listen, I share this with you because, see, for Joash, for the hidden potential to become realized potential in his life, he had to understand and he had to realize, he had to have this choice to remain hidden. He understood the importance of remaining hidden, or at least the people watching him understood the importance of seeing him remain hidden in the very presence of God. And listen, I share this with you because in fact, I put on my notes this way, is you got to understand something. If you want to see hidden potential become realized potential in your life, is that obscurity is actually the incubator of maturity. Obscurity is actually the incubator of maturity. And listen, the reason I think a lot of us haven't reached maturity is because we haven't embraced obscurity. The reason we haven't reached maturity sometimes in our walk and our relationship with God is because a lot of us, we fail to embrace seasons and times of obscurity, of just getting alone, getting away, being in the presence of God. See, spiritual maturity isn't about how old you are, even how long you've been saved. Spiritual maturity is a function of how much time you've spent in the presence of God. And if you want maturity, if you want to see the potential God has put in you come to fruition, you've got to embrace some obscurity. You gotta get alone with God. You gotta take some time to block out the noise and just get away and be in His presence. See, so often people, we want to grow up and we want to see that potential realized and we want to find maturity without ever spending any time in His presence. But listen, a seed can't be seen and sown at the same time. A seed can't be seen and sown at the same time. And so if you feel like there's a ministry in you, if you feel like there's a dream in you, if you feel like there's a miracle just waiting to come out of you, listen, you're going to have to embrace some times of obscurity, times where you learn to get alone with God. I like how Jesus speaks of this. Matthew 6, verses 6 through 7, He says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to find a quiet, secluded place so you won't be tempted to role play before God. Just be there as simply and honestly as you can imagine. The focus will, and get this, the focus will shift from you to God and you'll begin to sense His grace. That's really important there. The focus will shift from you to God and you'll begin to sense His grace. See, what Jesus is getting at here, he's talking about prayer and getting in His presence and spending time, away from the distractions, or away from the noise, and really embracing obscurity so they can walk and embrace maturity ultimately. And he kind of contrasts them. He says, hey, look, he kind of points out like the religious folk who at the time they would love to kind of go out in the streets and pray these really loud, obnoxious kind of prayers that kind of draw attention to themselves. And so they would do all these things, say all these things, and try to get the focus shifted on them. And yet, I love Jesus' response. In fact, in verse 7 in the NASB, it puts it this way. It says, and when you're praying, though, he contrasts it. He says, don't use meaningless repetition as the Gentiles do, for they suppose that they will be heard for their many words. Okay, so what he's getting at, when he says Gentiles, you got to understand something. Gentiles were not irreligious people. They were not unspiritual. In fact, they prayed just as much as the Jewish leaders did. See what he's getting at here, he's getting at something that I think is so key for some of us, and the reason I think so many of us really struggle when it comes to what feels like whether our prayers are very effective, or when we wrestle with that question, man, why does it even matter? Is because I think a lot of us, we can have this tendency to kind of do what the Gentiles did, do what the Jewish leaders did, is we go into prayer thinking that prayer is all about getting God's attention. And listen, if I nag Him enough, if I pray enough, if I'm noisy enough, if I say the right words and I come up with the right formula, somehow I'm going to get God's attention. And maybe if I can get His attention, He'll do something for me. But the interesting thing, when you look throughout the Bible, you realize that you already have God's attention. In fact, Jesus Himself said, look, I already know what you need even before you ask it. You already have His attention. See, I share this because, listen, what if prayer is not about us getting God's attention, but setting our attention onto God? What if prayer, the focus isn't about getting God's attention, but setting our attention onto God? As truth is, what I've found in my life, and maybe you found this true too in yours, is when I go through seasons where I feel like God's voice is really quiet, or I feel like it's distant. Or I sit there and I look at a situation, I'm like, God, I just don't get it. I don't understand. Where are you at? You feel absent to me. What I've come to find is that more often than not, if I'm honest, if I'm really honest, it has less to do with God not speaking, as if God gets a cold or like all of a sudden loses his voice and doesn't want to talk to me. But it has everything to do with the fact that if I'm honest, I'm not taking the time to listen. I'm not taking the time to get in His Word. I'm not taking the time to get in His presence. I'm not taking the time to really seek Him, to set my attention onto Him. And again, and don't get me wrong on this, because you can sit there and hear this and think, oh, okay, that's great. Well, I don't need to ask God for anything. I just kind of go to Him and I'm just sitting there. I'm just waiting. God, speak. No, I'm saying just the opposite. Because here's the thing, is when you shift your focus, when you shift your focus on not trying to get God's attention, but set your attention on God, really what we're talking about here is opening up your approach to prayer. And listen, approach matters. Like I'm a dad of a 9-year-old, and so in fact, actually this past week, for some reason, it just seemed like We went to an outlet mall, which that was mistake number one. But like, we take there, and it's like he's just constantly asking, Dad, can I get this? I just want a Jurassic Park Lego. If I could just have this. And he would just nag me the whole time around there. And each time I'd be like, stop it. You're not getting this toy. It's not going to happen. And yet he did do something that was a little bit different this last time. I can tell he's kind of growing, is that he got to a point where, like, he did the whole kind of repetitive asking. He's like, Dad, especially with this Beaver football he really wanted. And eventually he kind of exhausted himself, and he's like, Dad, if you don't get it for me, that's okay. That's all right. I'll be good. How many like, my whole response totally changed. Like, all of a sudden I'm like, yeah, buddy, if you want one foot, how about you want all 20 of the footballs here? You have whatever you want. Because approach matters. And listen, when it comes to prayer, when it comes to seeking God, the approach matters. And listen, when I'm talking about when we go into prayer, it's so important that we enter in with a heart of gratitude, which we're actually going to be talking about in a few weeks from now. But not just that, but just praise and worship and getting our focus on how great our God is and how good our God is, and having this sort of attitude of gratitude and seeing who He is in our lives rather than always focusing on what we feel we're not or what we feel we don't have. And listen, here's why I say this affects our asking. And I think I've shared some of this illustration before with some of you, but I think it's pertinent to what we're talking about. I remember when my wife and I were in Bible college, and I noticed her pretty early on. I knew she was the one. I wasn't quite so sure she saw me in the same light. And so I remember that day, just when I finally worked up enough courage to like ask her out just for coffee. I was like, man, if I can just get her, I'll start there. Because I don't know where she's at on the relationship side of things. I don't know what she thinks about me or not. And so that was a big ask for me. Was asking her for coffee. And so we went to coffee and we spent some time talking. I realized, hey, there might be something to this. And then next thing you know, as the relationship grew, as I got to know her more and she got to know me more, the ask got a little bit bigger. Like it went from going to coffee to, hey, let's go get dinner. And then it got a little bit bolder from there. It's like, hey, let's go on a real official date. And then it really got bold when I said, hey, I know you love watching Hallmark movies, but can we watch a Dallas Cowboy game? It's just a reprieve, right? It's a bold request, right? And eventually got to the place where as the relationship grew, the bolder and the brasher and the bigger the ask got, to the point where I asked her to marry me, right? And the same works when it comes to our relationship with God. When you take time to shift it as first trying to get God's attention, but set your attention on God. You enter prayer with a heart of thanksgiving, a heart of worship, and you remind yourself how great and how big our God is as you grow in your relationship and your understanding of who He is. When you remind yourself that the same God of yesterday is the same God today and forever. The same God who parted the waters for Moses in Egypt is the same God who can make a way in your situation, in your circumstance. The same God who healed the broken, healed the lame, healed the hurting, restored sight to the blind is the same God working and moving and here in this place tonight. When you realize that, when you grow in your understanding of who He is, when you're reading His Word and you're soaking in the promises of God, and listen, you can't help but start praying some bigger, some bolder, some brasher prayers. And listen, I wonder for some of us, the reason our prayer lives are so boring and prayer it just seems dull to us is not because our prayers are too big, but they're too small. And partially that's a reflection of just not knowing who He is. Because I think if you really knew the God that we're praying to, I think it would change radically a lot of the type prayers we pray. And in fact, interesting, kind of start to wrap up with this a little bit. In fact, we actually see this in the story. We actually see this in the story is again when it comes back to Joash in 2 Kings 11. It gets to verse 10 and basically, he's been 6 years, he's remained hidden. 6 years, he's remained hidden in the temple. Here next to the very presence of God, soaking in the presence of God, growing in grace, growing in his understanding, growing in this relationship. And then something interesting happens in the 7th year, when on his 7th birthday, all of a sudden the priests, they call all these generals, they call all these religious leaders of the nation of Israel, all these people, and man, I would have loved to have been there. Because can you imagine, I mean, all these people who thought the promise was dead, thought it was over. Oh, there's no way this is going to happen. There's no way, God's abandoned us. God's left us. The priest comes over, hey, I want to show you something. And can you just imagine? Pulls the veil back. And here's Joash, his 7th birthday. Yeah, in Jewish law, the 7th year was significant because that meant that you were mature. The number 7 at least meant that you were mature. And by law, you could actually take the throne. But even more significant to this, here's what I love. It says in verse 10. It says, then he gave the commanders the spears and the shields that had belonged to King David and were in the temple of the Lord. Get this. The spears and the shields that belonged to King David and were in the temple of the Lord. Like, you mean to tell me, like, there were weapons in God's house? There were weapons at his disposal? There were weapons right around him the whole time? Like... And get this, I mean, man, and think about this. Like, if you knew David, like David had weapons. David had a sling, he had a stone, he had a baby shield. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, he had all this stuff. But what was David's main weapon? It was his worship. See, David was a guy who understood that, hey, look, it's not about God somehow getting God's attention. It's about me fixing my attention on God. Like as a result, and as he grew in his relationship, as he worshiped our God, and as he set his attention on, like David, talk about a guy who prayed some bold prayers. Just read through Psalms and you'll see some bold, some brash, some big prayers because he knew the God he was praying to. There was a relationship growth there, and I love this. And listen, the same holds true for us. It's in his presence. And when we enter in with this worship, we find weapons there that I think some of us don't even realize that we had before. Weapons like faith, weapons like courage, weapons like character. Something about it just grows us. In fact, I was thinking about this, and I came across this story. It was a song. There was a song put out by a church, a New Life in the UK, and I love the song. It's a great worship song. But what I love more than the song is actually the backstory, the story that actually motivated this song. And I want you to take a look at this video that kind of gives the story here. Oh, is there no sound on that? Why don't you? All right, well, this is going to be me retelling the story. So basically what she had, I know, I'm kind of bummed on there that didn't have sound, but she was diagnosed with an illness that for years, they said there was that debilitated her, like she couldn't walk, she couldn't move at all. In fact, it says it right there, that she was confined to bed for 9 years. And she goes and she spends some time in this church. She spends some time just worshiping. And one of her big prayers was, man, I just want to be able to move. I just want to be able to get out of this wheelchair. And so she spends time, in God's presence. She spends time in His church, and just something miraculous ultimately happened was that as she spent time, again, fixing her focus on God, and just reminding herself of the greatness and the goodness and the mercy of our God, there's just something happened. And in fact, I don't know if it'll bring it up here, but it was during one of the worship experiences, one of the times where they're just giving praise to God, setting their focus on Him, that all of a sudden, like, she got up and she started walking. And she started dancing. I mean, in 9 years, she hadn't been able to move. 9 years, she hadn't been able to get out of this chair. And yet, all of a sudden, like, just something changed. Something, as she spent time in God's presence, like, the miraculous happened. And I love it. And it's not that she's, totally healed. Like, those scars are still the results, of the illness that she's wrestling with. And yet she's still believing. She's believing that listen, I'm going to find healing even with these scars, some of the stuff that I'm dealing with on the after effects. And of course, they would actually later on in the end of the video actually go on to show her running a marathon and completing the Dublin 10K. And again, you can turn the video off, but I share that with you because, again, it just reminds us of the power and the hidden potential when we get alone into the presence of God. When we block out the noise and we remind ourselves the power of prayer. Listen, prayer is so powerful. Time with God is so powerful. So often we just take it for granted and we allow the enemy to distract us and keep us from its potential. And look, don't get me wrong in this. When I look at her story, I look at Joash's story, I'm not saying that instantly things are, as you just worship God, everything's going to be perfect and great and rosy and all that. Sometimes it's a process. I mean, it's certainly, and I don't know why for her it took 9 years. I don't know why for Joash it took 6 years. I mean, really, what's the difference between a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old? I don't know why it took so long. I don't know when it comes to the miracle you're praying for, when it comes to the potential that God's put in you, that dream He's put in you, and you're still waiting to see it happen. Look, I don't know when that is going to be. I don't know when it's going to end, but I do know where it starts. When it comes to seeing that dream, when it comes to seeing His purpose, when it comes to seeing His healing come to fruition, look, I don't know when or how it's going to end, outside of it's going to end for your good and ultimately His glory, but I know especially where it starts. And it starts in just getting in His presence. Listen, if you'll stay in His presence, if you'll abide in Him, if you'll stay in His word, if you'll keep on praying, even when you don't feel like it,